lest you think that all descriptive metadata schemas are about art, let's take a look at a schema that has one of my favorite names, the Darwin Core. Now, Darwin Core, I think pretty obviously, builds on Dublin Core. Remember back in the Dublin Core unit, we looked at communities that build on Dublin Core for use in a particular field or domain. We looked at education, we looked at government. Biodiversity was not one of the communities listed on the Dublin Core site, but Darwin Core comes out of work by the biodiversity community and builds on Dublin Core in a similar way. So the Darwin Core is a set of elements like Dublin Core, but it's a set of elements used to describe things in the universe of biodiversity. And this document here that you're looking at says right off the bat, the Darwin Core type vocabulary extends DCMI and provides a list of approved values. So right off the bat, we're being told this builds on Dublin Core, and also there are going to be recommendations for how to select values for these elements. Now, scroll down a bit. Basis of record is the root element in Darwin Core. And Darwin Core is implemented in XML. So there's always going to be a root tag, a root element, and then children, and then children of those, et cetera, in the hierarchy. We're not going to look at the XML schemas here. We're just going to look at the Darwin Core documentation. But let's take a look at basis of record. Because basis of record, the term basis of record, we have the identifier, and this URL refers to this location in this document. So again, like in Dublin Core, we have this self-referential thing happening where the definition of basis of record is being said to be at this location in this document. Definition: a subtype of DC terms type. So the root element of Darwin Core is being declared as a subtype of Dublin Core's type element. Now, remember that Dublin Core type describes the nature or genre of a resource. And the type of thing that can be described using type is an individual object like an image or a video file or something, or a compound object like a collection, or something that is not an object at all like an event or a piece of software or a service. So let's go back here and look at the children of basis of record, and that is this list here. So we have a couple of different events, occurrence and event. We have a couple of different specimens, types of specimens, a couple of different ways of doing observations. The various ways that you might want to describe something, terms you might want to use in describing something in the universe of biodiversity. Now, there is a much larger set of elements in Darwin Core than just those children of basis of record, and those are articulated here. All of the elements that you might want to use to refine occurrence, or everything you might want to say about an event or about a location, etc. So let's actually look at a few of those. For example, under event, let's look at event date. Identifier is, again, this URL. That's where that URL resolves to. So again, you have this self-referential thing happening. Recommended best practice is to use an encoding scheme such as ISO 8601. which we've already looked at. It's the encoding scheme that we've seen for encoding date and time. Right? So right off the bat, we have a recommendation. If you're going to describe the date of an event, here is a recommendation for how to encode that date and time stamp. Use this schema. Back it up. Under location, continent, for example. Recommended best practice is to use a controlled vocabulary such as the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names, or the ISO 3166 Continent Code. So we have two recommendations here, either this ISO 3166 or the Thesaurus of Geographic Names. If you want to describe a continent using Darwin Core, here are two distinct thesauri that, well, one thesaurus and one encoding scheme that you might use to choose values for a continent. Back up again, and we have under geological context, earliest eon or lowest eonothem. I have no idea what that means. But again, the full name of the earliest possible whatever, and some examples. Not an encoding scheme, not a thesaurus, but just some suggestions for terms you might use. They're not required. Very little is required in Darwin Core, just as in Dublin Core. Lots of recommendations, but very little is actually required. So what we have here is an element set. Darwin Core is an element set. Many elements have or come with recommendations for how to select values for those elements. Here's a recommendation for a controlled vocabulary to pull up terms from, or here's a way of encoding, here's an encoding scheme to use as, for example, for dates, or here's simply a set of recommended terms. So in this, Darwin Core is very much like Dublin Core. It's an element set with recommendations for how to select values. Very little is required, lots is recommended. But the big difference here is where Dublin Core is broad and shallow. You can describe literally anything using a bare minimum number of elements. Darwin Core is narrow and deep. I mean, the biodiversity universe is fairly broad, to be fair. It's a very large area of science, but it's much narrower than, the entire universe of everything that exists. So Darwin Core is much narrower in scope, but it's also much deeper than Dublin Core. You can describe entities and resources and whatnot in biodiversity in a great deal of depth.